the site has challenges that will make it very difficult to develop without waivers in this zone. So we just want to go through that with Barry of Woodard and Kern, and I'm going to turn it over to him if we don't have any additional questions at this time.
Any questions?
Well, I guess just a quick one. Where is the EMS currently? Because it says no EMS apparatus, spare living space. I'm just curious as to where are they currently? Is it just parked, or are they not there at all?
I'm happy to invite Chief Chase up. He's here, and I'm sure he could answer that. Sure.
Or if there's another time, I can table for now. But yeah, go ahead.
No, that's a great question. We currently staff 2 ambulances 24/7. So we have one located at the Center Street Station and one on Minot Ave. Our call volume has increased to the point that through the last few budget processes, we've been trying to get a 3rd staffed ambulance. And the most appropriate place for that to get staffed in the future would be in the new Auburn station.
Thank you.
I'm a hand talker, and so I'm going to try to keep my finger on the button, so I apologize in advance. I'm Barry Sheff from Woodard and Kern, and really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you. And what's really important here is to help give you a sense of the direction that we're heading. We've completed schematic design at this point, but we have not advanced much further than that. And, if you can go to the next slide, great, thank you. So I'm going to hit 3 things. There's about 5 or 6 slides. Just talk a little bit about the project background, talk a little bit about the existing conditions and the proposed conditions and those waivers, and hopefully you've had a chance to read that very brief memo, sort of letter that I submitted, and then just an opportunity for discussion. We're really just hoping for some feedback on some of these things. Next slide. So as John kind of talked a little bit about, 2020, there was a public safety assessment that we completed, a facility study that we completed with the city. You have probably recall the public safety bond that went before the voters earlier in November. And this is really, again, just trying to build on this legacy of excellence for the city. Engine 2 is the oldest of the 3 fire stations. If you haven't had a chance to go and visit it, and I think you would be amazed that our fire department is able to operate out of that facility. And the idea of this Engine 2 project is to build a purpose-built, right-sized facility. As John said, there are no drive-through apparatus bays. Right now, they back in and pull out. Obviously, backing fire trucks, as we all know, we try to pull forward, and backing is a challenging movement for fire trucks. And the other thing that's important about this, and what you're going to hear as part of the Engine 2 project, is to maintain uninterrupted 24/7 service of that station. We can't relocate, as the chief will speak to if you have questions, but we can't relocate those operations during construction. Next slide. So the existing conditions, this is in the traditional neighborhood T4.2B zone. It's 180 South Main Street. There are a number of current non-conformance with the current zoning. There's a maximum principal front yard, which is in this zone 25 feet. The building is set back roughly 50 feet currently. There's an existing residential salt shed. We call it a salt shed, but it's pictured in the lower portion that's within the front yard setback. The maximum lot exceeds the current exceedance of 120 feet, which is the requirement in the standard. Vehicle entrances, there are multiple vehicle entrances. Obviously, for operational purposes, we try to, the intent with the existing condition is to try to get folks that are using the facility, whether it's to pick up sand and salt as a residential user, or if you're on the fire staff and you're a crew, to park. We use that separate driveway. I'm going to call it Plan East. And then there's a separate driveway for the apparatus, as you can see. Those multiple vehicle entrances are not permitted in the zoning, and they both exceed the maximum width of 20 feet. There's also minimum curb cut separation that we'll talk a little bit about that we're unable to meet as well. That's the existing condition. You can go to the next slide. Under the proposed condition, what you see here in the upper left is a preliminary rendering that was developed as part of this project, and in the lower right is the current draft site plan. Just to orient you all, South Main Street is at the bottom of the page. On the left-hand side, you can see the existing building, and it's hard for me. I would use my hands and fingers and point this out, but you can see the existing building is highlighted in brown. Currently, we're showing as you come in, the left-hand side driveway is provide employee access. So the employees will go around, they'll park on the left side of the building. The apparatus will go around the outside. It's a fairly sizable turnaround that's required for those apparatus to make those turning movements. They'll pull through those apparatus bays. On the right-hand side is a more pedestrian-facing entrance. That's where we'll provide an opportunity for residents to come in if they wanted to get a fire permit, burn permit, or to access that sand and salt during the winter use. But the important thing that we wanted to share was some of the requirements that we're unable to meet in the T4 2B, traditional neighborhood zone. So I'll just touch on them, on each of them. Again, the maximum principal front yard, as I said, the existing building is about 50 feet set back from the edge of the right-of-way. In order to maintain operations for the duration of construction, we're proposing to place the building, the new Engine 5 station, behind the existing building. That will allow us to construct the building, allow continuous operations, and then at the time when we can move into the new building, we'll demolish the existing building. So the proposal, as it's currently drafted, is puts us roughly 110 feet back off of the edge of the right-of-way. Maximum lot width, as I said, the lot is wider than the existing 120 feet. Currently, we're not proposing changes there. Vehicle entrance widths, there is a requirement. We have multiple entrances, as I described. We have a more residential, resident-facing entrance on the right side, plan right on the project, which we're proposing. Currently, we're trying to keep that as narrow as possible, just for impervious surface reasons. We don't want to have that be as large as it's currently shown as 23 feet. It is two-way, in and out. You'll see there are 4 parking spaces that hopefully you can see. I think there are 4, and one of which is a accessible space. The left-hand driveway, and those driveways are separated by, I think, around 60 feet or 50 feet, give or take. The second driveway on the left, as I said, for the apparatus and for employees is around 40 feet wide, and we're proposing, and we really need that in order to provide access through the apparatus bays. Two-way access drives is another one, and I could go through each based on the division, but I know you have a busy agenda tonight. But multiple two-way access drives are not permitted on a single lot, so that's another area that we would be requesting a waiver for. And then again, as I said, the minimum curb cut separation of 150 feet in this zone is not attainable for this site. I'm going to ask you to go to the next slide, or we can keep this up, but that's the extent of my presentation.
On the proposed, can you go back one slide? And maybe it's just because it's small, is the existing building like overlaid or somewhere on that Just I'm trying to, because in order to keep it open at the same time.
Can I go to the
Yeah.
board? Are we being televised yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that didn't show on the printout. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? So this is a workshop, so we're just kind of obviously having dialogue, discussion, thoughts.
So on your existing conditions, you speak about the salt shed. On your proposed conditions, the salt shed is absent. What changes do we anticipate with that?
As part of the schematic design, we haven't really studied the location of the salt shed, I'll be perfectly honest with you, but I would fully expect that getting it further away to be closer to those the residents' parking spaces, because what we want to avoid is having people turn in there, stop, someone else trying to come into the entrance as well.
So it would be
pushing
eliminated, it's just location to be determined.
location to be determined and outside of the setback.
So, is this a conforming use in the current zoning?
The public service is a special exception within the zone.
Okay. The reason I'm asking is expanding a non-conforming structure. It looks like there might be some possibility there. I was just curious why we weren't discussing that possibility in section 60-79, and I don't have time to read through it right now or discuss it, but we do have a ordinance that if it is a conforming use but not a conforming structure, there is some possibilities to go that way. But again, you guys could probably pick it apart and tell me why not. I just know that it exists.
Yeah, I think the decision was made because retrofitting that older constructed facility just could never meet current standards.
Okay. That must be one of the conditions then of the expansion. So something else was setback an issue with this? Is that one of the waivers that are needed, the front setback? Because I'm looking through our zoning ordinances now for that staff gave us, and I think there was another amendment made to T4.2B that if two structures are serviced by an entrance, then they don't have to meet the minimum setback. So my question is, does a salt shed count as a structure? Because technically, if this is serving a public service building and a salt shed, it shouldn't have to meet the front setback requirements. And that's just more of a detail. I realize that it's going to need other waivers, but it's just something, I don't remember exactly how it's worded, but I don't think it says principal structure. I think it just says any two structures, as long as they're served by a one single entrance, they don't have to meet the setback anymore.
I think we could look at that approach. I think it refers to shared access ways.
Yes.
Where these, I don't know, with two of them, if we could straight face that as a shared access way, maybe we could with that, but we can look at that approach.
Yeah, because I believe it says structure. It doesn't say principal structure. It doesn't say, so that was just another one. But anyways, that's all I had. I mean, we're gonna have to work around the zoning ordinance with this, obviously, but it looks like it's impacting some wetland in the back. And I just want to make sure we don't have any ordinances like in shoreland, because we're impacting so much wetland if it's going to follow any of those parameters. That's just a general question, though.
It's not within the shoreline zone, but it may require a Natural Resource Protection Act permit.
Yeah, I didn't know if we had a rule about if we're impacting so much wetland, it then follows the shoreline zoning ordinance.
We don't unless it's a wetland that is shoreline zoned.
Okay, thanks.
And I guess to get back to your point about the accessory structure, there's pretty clear language in the form-based code that says, it has to be 20 feet back from the existing property line. I think that's what they're up against. So we'll have to look at that provision, though, that for, driveway sharing a particular entity. I think that would open up a lot of opportunities for other development in the city if we allowed that. I think we should acknowledge that as a waiver and not look at it that way, in my opinion. But
And it is a pretty unique use. It's not something that a lot of the private sector is going to build, and you do need to stage these emergency vehicles, be able to pull them out of the building, park them, and close the doors.
Even under previous zoning, would similar waivers be requested?
Can you say that again, Bob?
I'm just wondering, under zoning that was in effect prior to 4.2B, would there be similar need for waivers?
Yeah, so if we looked, it was, I believe it was urban residential before. There would be some waivers, but we'd have to take a closer look at that. I'm not sure if all of those are permitted uses in the urban residential, but that's something we could look at. But I guess, I guess what's the point of the question? So,
Well, I just raised the question because it's not unique to 4.2B that would probably be having to deal with waivers for the new construction.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. They're unique projects in a largely residential zone to have to accommodate the large vehicles like this.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, seeing none, I think we're good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. All right, so next item on the agenda is workshop ordinance text changes related to the LD 2003. So I will hand it over to staff. Again, this is a workshop.
Thank you. So, trying to present this. Okay. So, what the purpose of this workshop is to really go over the what we've come to with the LD 2003 ad hoc committee and some advice from the city's legal, the city's attorney. So what we have done is use that to try to draft the actual ordinance text to get feedback, to then come back to the planning board for an eventual public hearing with your feedback. So first, we know what LD 2003 is. So we just have a quick summary of all the laws. LD 2003, LD 1473, and LD 1706 are all laws that are impacting our ordinances that we'll be amending. So today, there are several sections that we're proposing amending based on the requirements of LD 2003. So first, we have buildings per lot. And so in section 60-34, the existing language says that no more than one principal building shall be erected on any lot in a residential zoning district, except for two existing provisions. And then the proposal is to add 3, that 4 dwelling units may be constructed on vacant lots in the growth area as delineated in the future land use map in the most recent comprehensive plan, and must be permissible in compliance with 30A MRSA, section 4364, and in accordance with section 6053 and 6054. So we'll get down to that later, but MRSA, that's the LD 2003 name of the law. So when we reference that, that's what we're referring to. And then a lot in the growth area, as delineated in the future land use map, in the most recent comprehensive plan with an existing dwelling unit, may add 1 attached dwelling unit, 1 detached dwelling unit, or 1 of each for a total of 3 dwelling units. So that got back to the question about, do we want to have, for an existing lot, do we want to also allow them to have 4 dwelling units, or only for a new undeveloped lot? So this is where the LD 2003 committee came down on. So this is our attempt to add this to the language of the ordinance. So the next piece is section 60-35, conversion of one-family dwellings. So one provision to be in compliance with LD 2003 is to allow for single-family dwellings to be converted into two or multifamily buildings located in the growth area. And that's because of the requirement in LD 2003 that multifamily buildings, up to 4 units really, must be allowed in the growth area within the city. And as I'm going, if we have any questions or want to stop or move faster or slower too.
I have a quick
Yeah.
question on that. Single-family dwellings may be converted into two or multifamily buildings? I guess I'm curious as to how are we defining multifamily buildings, and is it two physical? Like,
Yeah, I
guess
noticed that when I was writing. I think what the intention was to say two family buildings, so like a duplex, for example.
Okay, or multifamily buildings, so you could make it into three?
Three, 4, yep.
Does it tap out at 4? And if so, is it clearer to say maybe converted up to 4 units versus, because to me, into two or multifamily buildings is just confusing if they're both the same.
My thought with that, and if anyone has thoughts, feel free to add, but my thought there was if we say up to 4, that might eliminate the possibility in the zone to actually do more if there's space that allows it. And I think we do need to allow for, in multifamily buildings, in the building code anyway, count as anything from 3 units and above. So that's why I chose that. But if there's...
We could reference back to the district that it's located in, though, to cap it at 4, where that's what allowed, where we're trying to limit the number of units in an existing residential zone. But for instance, if you were in the T51 zone, where multifamilies are explicitly already permitted, then you could go above the 4. But we could clear that up, I think, by adding 2 family and referencing back to the zone for the number of units.
I think that would help. Thank you.
I think just to clarify this, though, the language is clear from a legal perspective, and the reason why is that this is a conversion of a one-family dwelling. So under the LD 2003, it allows up to 3. So you could put 2 additional units in there, making it a multifamily at that point. So that's where this language is very clear in terms of meeting the LD 2003 requirement. I wouldn't suggest changing it. This allows up to 3 if they meet the area that is under the comprehensive plan and that is identified in the future land use map in the growth area. That's the growth area, and then obviously if it had available sewer and water. So either one or the other qualifies you. So I think in this particular case it works.
And this is a point that I'll probably talk about later, but I'm curious about the language you're reading that allows 4 units on a parcel. I'd be interested in our legal team's opinion on whether that has to be in the same structure, because there's been different interpretations on that, because we may have to allow 4 units on a parcel in the designated growth zone, but I don't see anywhere in LD 2003 that specifically says you have to allow all 4 of these units in the same structure. So I would just, again, it's a matter of interpretation of the law, but I don't see anywhere in LD 2003, that blatantly says we have to allow them in the same structure, meaning up to 4. So if the underlying zone only allowed for duplexes, I believe that they would have to do 2 duplexes instead of 1 4-unit to comply with the underlying zone standards. But I'm more asking, it's a question and a statement at the same time. I'd love a legal opinion on it. And if legal says no, it means we have to allow 4-unit buildings, then by golly, we'll allow 4-unit buildings. But if we don't have to, I think that should be a part of the conversation. Because again, a 4-unit in some of these zones doesn't make a lot of sense. Like a really rural zone. At least it doesn't to me. So anyways, that's my point on this slide. I'm done.
Yeah, Brian, I think you make a good point. 4-story, like if it's a single structure and you're saying 4 stories, when we have.
Sorry, 4 units in a structure, not 4
Right.
stories.
Right, but it could be 4 stories. They could just go vertical, right? Stacked on top of one another. Then we're into that height restriction of 35 feet in some of the more rural areas. I think that's maybe a point that you're getting at.
I'm thinking more of like a 4-unit structure that has 2 units on the first floor and 2 units on the second floor type of thing. That would be allowable by the height requirements in those zones, but wouldn't be allowable under the current zoning. And does LD 2003 say we have to allow for those buildings? And reading the language, I don't see it. But again, if legal says so, then they say so. But I'm just saying I don't see that language. I see it says it have to allow 4 units on a parcel, just not in a structure. I don't. And again, I'll concede if legal says otherwise, or if you guys really want to push it. But I think the point of this committee and this workshop was to get the minimum standards for LD 2003. And if we want to pass additional ones, then I'd be open to that. But I think what this was initially getting after was the minimum. So I would argue that the minimum doesn't make us do 4-unit buildings everywhere in the growth zone.
John, I got a follow-up though to your height thing. I mean, if we still have, I'm assuming that there are still regulations or things that we need to work within, such as the height, that we're not going to say, okay, well, LD 2003 says we can bypass it and we need to ignore it, right? I mean, there are certain aspects of the zones that we still need to work within.
Right, and that was just an example of, 35 feet in the rural zone. And I think that Ryan's onto something that, some of these zones say 2-family, so maybe that is 2 duplexes in that particular case and not a 4-unit that has 2 on the bottom and 2 on the top. But that's a consideration I hadn't thought about, and I think it's worth asking, because in my mind, as long as it didn't go 35 feet high, I was probably allowing it, but that's a good point to bring up. I think it's worth. This is what the workshop's for, and these are some of the points we want to drive at.
And if we're doing these questions along the way, can I bring us back a slide?
Yes, absolutely.
So I like this language, but at the bottom it says, the second paragraph, 4th line down, it says existing dwelling unit. Should that say existing single-family unit? Because, for example, if you have a duplex, does LD 2003 allow you to then do 1 additional attached and 1 detached sort of thing? Because I thought the accessory dwelling unit stuff was for single-family only. And again, I don't know if our ordinance just allows something different, but I would think dwelling unit should probably be existing single-family unit, or however you would word that.
My thought here would be, and correct me if you guys think differently, but my thought would be that if it's an existing duplex, they would still have the ability to add a 3rd detached unit. Because I would argue that the single-family unit, there's already 2 units in the 1 building. So my thought would be that if they are going to add 1, they should at least be able to have the second not attached structure.
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm just complicating it in my mind. I just looked at that and I thought, doesn't it say single family? But again.
Bill, we can see clarity on that to make sure we get it right.
Okay, and part of this too, we're suggesting, so in the discussions with the committee, we were discussing, to the best of our ability, trying to consolidate the language that would make the ordinance conform with LD 2003 into 1 general section. So in section 60-53, it's a proposed new section which says that additional dwelling units must be permissible on certain parcels in the city of Auburn pursuant to section 60-34. And so what we did here to summarize that, and also part of that is that they're not mandated in the Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District. So we covered that piece of the LD. And additional dwelling units allowed under this section are subject to more stringent lot size requirements per unit if located in the Taylor Pond watershed. So that's another thing we discussed together with the committee. So what we did here, I'll just quickly run through them, and if we have questions, we can stop. But for the Agricultural and Resource Protection District, we discussed additional dwelling units needing to meet the requirements of the ag zone. So you can, for example, add a second or a second unit, or even maybe even a third if there's enough space, and if each of the units were to be accessory to an agricultural recreational use. So for low-density country residents and for low-density rural residents and suburban residents, yep, okay. For those ones, what we are suggesting is that for the first unit and accessory unit, keep the minimum lot size the same as it is now, and for each subsequent unit, require an additional 50% of that original lot size. So for in the low density country residential district, if you've already put your accessory dwelling unit and you want to put the third one, you would need to have at least 4.5 acres. And if you want to put 5, you would need to have at least 6 acres, etc. And that holds true for the low density rural residents, and it really just cuts that initial minimum lot size in half for those 3 zones: low density country residential, low density rural residents, and suburban residents.
I would just add for those zones, we would limit the number of units to either 3, if there was an existing dwelling there, the minimum for LD 2003, or 4 if it was a vacant lot, the minimum for LD 2003.
And we have kind of done we've taken a similar approach in the following zones. So for the urban residence zoning district, multifamily, suburban, and both general business and general business 2, they all currently require just slightly more lot area to have a duplex and then a multifamily. So in that zone right now, you don't need quite as much land to do, say, a duplex or a multifamily as you would in the suburban residence zone. So we followed that through and elaborated on it to meet LD 2003 by saying that for each of those zones, you need an additional 2,000 square feet of lot area for each subsequent unit. So that we felt like that made sense for those zones. And so the next one's form-based code. All of these ones, form-based code, the industrial district, Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District, and Taylor Pond Watershed. There is essentially no change. So in form-based code, there is no density limit. So adding density, so really this doesn't apply in that way. The form and the size of the lot will regulate how many units can be on that lot. Industrial zone, there is no housing currently allowed. LD 2003 does not mandate housing in the industrial zone. No change to Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District. And for the Taylor Pond watershed, you can allow for additional units on the lot, but only if you have the same size lot for each subsequent units as you do for the first. So if the underlying zone is urban residential, you need 10,000 for one unit, 20,000 for two, 30,000 for three. And let's see. And we also added section 6054. So pursuant to LD 2003, a density bonus of 2.5 times the maximum number of dwelling units permitted in the underlying zone shall be permitted where water and sewer service is available, and the development is in the growth area as delineated in our future land use map. Off-street parking requirements may not exceed 2 spaces for every 3 units for affordable housing density bonus. And that's all outlined in LD 2003. So this is really kind of a copy and paste, move that down into our ordinance. So the next few we can go right through. We have looked at all of the individual zoning ordinances, and for the ordinances that only allow 1 and 2 family dwellings, and this gets at Ryan's point, which we will need to check out. We've proposed that multifamily dwellings with up to 4 units in the growth area be allowed, subject to subdivision review in the zones that don't automatically allow those. So low-density country residential, low-density rural residential, proposing multifamily dwelling units. Suburban residence district, same thing. And same with the urban residence district, but I think we should check on that to see if that's the correct interpretation. And one change in the multifamily suburban district is to eliminate the clause that multifamily dwellings in existence on in existence on September 23rd, 1988. If we're going to allow multifamily dwellings, then I think when they were built, it becomes irrelevant, not something that we should enforce or mandate. And finally, we only have to change something for the parking requirements in form-based code. So under the notes, under the parking and use matrix in form-based code, the proposal is to add number 6 for affordable developments. Off-street parking requirements may not exceed 2 spaces for every 3 units. And that was covered above, further up in the bonus density. And
sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Right there. 2 things sort of off of that. So another reason for my point to specify whether 4 units are allowed in all the other zones is then this parking requirement would have to be enforced in that zone if it is considered affordable. So it's important that we know this answer because, for example, in a rural area, if we then allow for 4-unit buildings, which are considered multifamily, this would then be applicable in that area, if I'm not mistaken, because this is applicable wherever multifamilies are allowed. And if we stuck to 1 and 2 family uses, this would no longer be applicable. So that's another really important reason. And another point I want to add to this, should we add language about no additional parking being required for an accessory dwelling unit, or is that already in our ordinances? Because I think LD 2003 specifies that.
I don't know the answer.
General question, we're
Yeah.
workshopping, but
Yeah, we'll work on getting clarity on those questions for a final version.
yeah, and it might already be in our ordinance somewhere. It's just a question that came up because I saw this.
Yeah, and I guess my question too would be that the additional lots, is that, I mean, we have an ADU provision now. Does the density affect the ADU provision? The way that it reads, it looks like it may. So I just want to make sure that, and if we are considering that, which is a more conservative approach in terms of land use and density, we'll have to go back and amend that language as well in that section.
In the packet we got, like understanding LD 2003, it says accessory dwelling unit parking, additional parking requirements for ADU beyond those required for single-family dwelling are not permitted. This advice says.
And I don't think, if this is what you were just talking about too, in terms of density, I don't think we can require additional land area for an accessory dwelling unit, right?
No,
Like
not for an
for-
accessory dwelling unit.
Okay.
So units after that, I think, is where it becomes an open question.
Any other questions for staff?
I'd like to go back to 60-53. We considered minimum lot area, but we didn't speak to minimum road frontage.
Yep. So, based on an opinion from the city's attorney, we believe it would be, the preference that we've come up with so far is to limit, or is to not require additional parking for each additional road frontage for each additional lot. And part of that, for functionality, I'm thinking of sprawl. So if we require more road frontage for more lots, that spreads out the houses more. And I think that that doesn't seem like it's in alignment with the comprehensive plan in terms of trying to develop close and infill development. But we can,
Yeah, I think we have a solid opinion from the city attorney on that. I think there's an exception that allows us to require the same lot area, the same density for each additional unit, but it does not allow us to require frontage times the number of units, or if it did, then it would also allow setbacks. So if you have a 25-foot front setback for one unit, you could have 100-foot for a 4-unit. Our city attorney's opinion is that LD 2003 does not allow us to regulate in that way.
Because earlier discussion, we had talked about that, and we thought that we could at that time.
So
You're
we-
saying since then, we've had an opinion.
We had that as a question. My opinion has been that we couldn't the whole time. We did have differing opinions, and that part of the challenge, and Ryan alluded to this, is there is no case law yet. It's all interpretations of individual attorneys, and we got different opinions on some of this out of different staff in the same department at the state. MMA has provided some opinions, and I think it's really coming down to an interpretation without case law to rely on from individual attorneys. And our attorney, his opinion is that we cannot require frontage at this times the number of units. There's a very specific exception for us to require the minimum lot size or density for each unit in that section, and it does not apply to other dimensional standards.
I guess it bothers me that we can increase density and squeeze more units to, whatever the frontage was originally. So we can create more dwellings, but at the same time, with dwellings come the toys that we all have, particularly vehicles. So it's bothersome. Where are we going to put the additional cars and so forth, and toys, boats and winter vehicles and so forth? So I think we are creating a situation, and I guess from earlier discussion, I thought that we could increase the frontage to some degree. It would be helpful. The other issue I have a concern with is that, they don't necessarily have to be side by side, that we can maybe have a dwelling unit go to the rear. What does that do with respect to addresses for public safety?
Yeah, each unit will have to apply for an address, and our addressing officer would dictate what, based on the 911 standards for EMS, would dictate what those numbers are.
So
The
if we're
system of numbering
stacking
is-
one house behind another, we'll have a A and a B?
They do not recommend using letters in those addresses. We could show you the guidelines, but there is a set of guidelines that are required for new addresses. They don't recommend using letters like that, Unit A, Unit B, but there is a numbering system or a building numbering system. Could be building 1, 2, 3 at 650 Minot Avenue.
Now, Bob's bringing up a really valid point, and I've been having the same questions in the back of my mind. Number one, I applaud staff and the ad hoc committee. This is a huge amount of information and a lot of legalese. Unfortunately, LD 2003 passed down from Augusta, I don't think has clarity for the muddy waters of the topics you're bringing up, because I've thought of them too. I think any reasonable person does, and I think what we're going to find is we're not going to be the only municipality with those kinds of obstacles when it comes to, okay, yeah, we have the housing, but what about everything that comes with it? There's so much to this. You know, what's it going to do to school districts? How many more kids in a school? Trash pickup, water, sewer, and we can go on and on. I totally hear you, Bob, because I've been thinking the same thing. I just don't know if we have an answer. Do we? For the minutia, the details, the common everyday lifestyle of everybody, where all of a sudden we're going to have a density, we could have a density explosion in areas that aren't accustomed to it. Anyway, I don't think there's answers for a lot of those questions, and I don't think it's necessarily, I'm losing my words, but I understand what Bob's saying. I've been thinking the same thing, and unfortunately, I don't know if there's a clear-cut answer given the direction this is going.
Yeah, I think if we saw a build-out to the maximum that LD 2003 says we need to allow, that would be an explosion in density. We have zones now that allow for multifamily, and we've always seen some development. There's still a lot of unutilized development potential because it's all individual property owners choosing to do something or not. I think along the lines of what Bob was saying, we do know that the one area where the proposal is that we're being consistent with how we have interpreted and required density in existing zones that had an allowance for additional dwelling units already with less lot area than the first one requires, with less lot area for the second or third unit than the first unit. I think we've established that accessory dwellings, we can't require additional land area, but that next one, we could require the same land area that is required of the first unit. That's the one piece, I think, in this draft ordinance where we're being slightly more flexible than what LD 2003 requires, where if you require 10,000 square feet in the urban res for one unit, you could do the accessory unit still on a single 10,000 square foot lot, but then that next unit, you could require an additional 10,000 where we're proposing we require 2,000 square feet of lot area. So that it doesn't get directly at the frontage question or concern that you have, Bob, but it does reduce the allowable density. We can reduce the allowable density further than what we have in the past for two families.
So as an alternative to not increasing frontage, if we require greater lot size, which might almost require that the first property has more frontage than required.
Either more frontage or more depth, but it would have to have more land area than what's proposed.
The other part of that, though, I think, to everyone's point that, we're worried about, density and development and things like that. I think very similar to what we did an analysis for the Lake Auburn watershed, and I think as staff, we could, based on this discussion, we passed our ADU housing in 2021, so we've got data, how many houses have been built. We can take a look at that and see, if there is a real big impact on the landscape, and maybe does that drive an additional, more conservative approach. I don't think that there's been a lot, but we'd certainly want to take a look at that. We can provide that data back to the planning board as we, vote on this stuff and make decisions.
Do we know, talking about kind of doing that analysis, do we know how many lots, for example, would qualify if we said, okay, 10,000 square feet and then 2,000 for additional unit, or if we said 10,000 and we're going to do 4,000, say, for each additional square foot? So we went with 10,000 and then 2,000, but do we know how many that actually equates to? And if we said 4 or 6 or maybe 10 and then another 10, I'm just curious as to if we know what that equates to from a number perspective.
We don't have data on that. We could do it. It would be quite an effort, I think, to do that citywide. We went with the way that we have treated the additional units traditionally under the existing ordinance, and those were zones where there's a lot size for the first unit and then a smaller lot size for each additional. That was sticking with the way that we've dealt with it in those zones traditionally.
And you've stayed with the 2,000, which was in effect prior to the city adopting the first ADU. So already we're using up the frontage or the required frontage or the area for one, allowing 2 with no change. But now we're talking about maybe adding a third, but we're only adding 2,000. So if we, prior to the city adopting the ADU ordinance, might it be wiser to say if we're going to go to now 3 units as opposed to 2, maybe we should double it to 4?
When we adopted the allowance for a second dwelling unit, we didn't have the restrictions that LD 2003 put on us. Now
Correct.
we can't require the extra 2,000 for the ADU the way that we have traditionally.
Are you saying that, that because we can't require an additional one for the first additional unit, that we should require possibly a higher area for each subsequent one? So instead of,
To some extent,
Okay.
I guess I was thinking before we, as a city, adopted allowing for an ADU on an existing lot. I think I heard earlier that if somebody wanted, before we had that allowance for an ADU, if they wanted to go to a second unit, that they had to have an extra 2,000.
Yes, yep, I follow you now with the 4,000, that makes sense. So you could require for that third unit, in the urban residential example, you could require up to an additional 10,000 square feet if that's what you as a board wanted to recommend. Right now it's written as 2,000, but, because that's how we've handled additional units in the past, but you could go as high as 10,000 for that third unit. In a zone that requires 10,000 for the first and second unit.
And I like what we're talking about. If we could you go back to the density, the chart? So I think for suburban residential and the more rural zones, I think it's, 20,000 or more square feet, and then 50% of that per unit. So I think in suburban residents, you would need essentially an acre to do 4 units, and that's quite a bit. For me, when I look at multifamily suburban, general business 1 and general business 2, we have it as 10,000 square feet and then an additional 2,000 square feet per unit right now. when I think about general business and I'll think about like a 10-unit building in that zone, that would be 28,000 square feet. I mean, it's like 0.6 of an acre, whatever that equates to. I'm thinking at that point, you're not going to be able to fit, a 20-unit development. I mean, that additional 2,000 square feet isn't going to be really, it's not going to help anything or limit anything, because you're going to be limited by your footprint. You're going to be limited by your parking requirements. So on the site, you won't even be able to fit that many units because your parking requirements are going to get in the way because you have to have so much parking per unit, etc. So I'm saying all this to say, I would actually be open to saying 10,000 square foot lot in those 3 zones specifically and no additional per unit, because in the end, we'd expect very high density in those areas. And I don't want to go down the road and just give waivers for density to a bunch of projects in those zones, especially if there's public parking nearby and they can fit it. But also, I think you can only cover a lot in those zones like 70%. You have to leave 30% green space or something like that. Am I correct on that?
There's a standard in each zone.
There's a standard.
80, yeah.
And I'm thinking by the time you have to reserve some open space, you have to have 1.5 parking spaces per unit. You're not going to be able to meet that density once you get into those 10 plus unit projects anyways. Meaning your limiting factor is now your footprint. So I personally I would be comfortable just getting rid of that, because I think you won't be able to do a 50 unit on a 10,000 square foot parcel because you couldn't fit all the parking spots. And we can just let that sort of govern the density in the area, your parking requirements and your green space requirements. So I'd love to hear what
But what about the affordable allowance, I guess, where it's, 2 for every 3? I mean, that's completely different than 1.5 per. So how would we factor?
They would already have a 2.5 times density multiplier, and also to go along with the parking requirements. So again, I think if you want to do a 50 unit development, you're going to get as much density as you can possibly fit on that. And it will more than meet our requirements, whether we require the additional or not. And we can do some math out here or something. It's an idea. But yeah, if it is an affordable development, they already get 2.5 times density multiplier. And when you do the math out on a lot, there's no way that you can take advantage of every single bit of it. At least I've done the math and it doesn't seem feasible.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of cases where you're running up against another limitation before you get to that density, whether it's wetlands or slopes or fire department access, paved areas around the building, lot coverage, all of those come into play.
Are you talking about the general businesses and the urban residential?
General businesses and multifamily suburban.
Multifamily suburban?
Yeah, I think in urban residents, suburban residents, all the other ones, it makes sense to have additional land area per unit, because we don't expect to see stuff packed in some of those zones. But again, we just, when you look at the planning board, they just took on a multifamily project on Center Street, right? Was that a 10 unit or more? And I'd be interested to see the density of that, but I'm pretty sure it still meets this requirement and it still fits the area. So, the planning board doesn't like the idea. We can just require this. I don't think it'll make a huge difference, but I just don't see this. There's really no need to control the density in those 3 zones, in my opinion, because they're going to run into other parameters, as Eric said, before they run into density.
Yeah, and I guess I would agree with that as well, because we're right into the density right now is at 17 units per acre. I don't see how you can even get beyond that, given site constraints, building heights, things like that. I don't see how you can get beyond 17 units per acre, and that's what we're dealing with right now. We're dealing with a height restraint at 45 feet, so we're really only at 4 stories max. So that in itself is probably limiting anyway. So.
And I think if you think about the zones kind of the way Ryan was, where there's sort of a continuum of very rural to higher density, more commercial, mixed use, is there a design? In the very rural zones, what we've proposed is that you have to have half of the original lot size for the 3rd unit, whereas urban res, I think, is the first time we break to that 2,000 square feet. Is there a desire to require something more for the 3rd dwelling unit than what we've proposed in the urban residential? just looking for kind of, if we're gonna make adjustments to a draft that ends up coming back to you for final, we want some consensus on how to do that. Urban res is the first one. If you're coming from general business up to multifamily suburban, is you're getting, well, same density, I guess, but less commercial with multifamily suburban. To Bob's point, we could require as much as 10,000 square feet for that third unit, but what we've done in the more rural zones in the draft is required the equivalent of 5,000 for that third unit, half of the initial unit's land area. So, welcome some feedback on the changes that Ryan identified and that, if you want to see something different in the next version.
For consistency's sake, having it match those prior zones with making it half as much, it would kind of make sense since it's now, if we're not requiring it for the last three. But also I would be interested in how much of the urban residential zones covered by the, in the comp plans development, or how much overlay between the proposed development area and the urban residential zone exists.
In the growth area?
Yeah, in the
I
growth
think the
area.
vast majority of
Most
it
of it, right?
is in the
Yeah,
growth
so
area.
I don't know. I think the 2,000 for 10,000 actually makes sense, but it would be more consistent to say 5,000. It would match what we did for suburban residential and low density use and ag zone.
I think especially considering that in urban residential, your first unit, the accessory dwelling unit, doesn't have to have any additional land area, but then the third has to have additional. That'd be 3 units on 12,000 square feet. So I think it would be fine to say 5,000 there, and it'd be 3 units on 15,000 square feet. Again, you're going to be hard pressed to meet your parking requirements, everything else for that third one, because then you have to start doing additional parking and everything. But I would feel more comfortable with that because urban residential is mostly 1 and 2 family right now. And in the end, it might impact a few sites, but I'm not seeing too many that it would. I don't really think there's a whole lot of lots that this would impact one way or the other because it would have to be in between 12,000 and 15,000 square feet to impact it.
I'd be fine with keeping the logic of a half again, so I'd be fine with the 5 as well. I wouldn't have any issues with it. I did have a question with regard to sort of the impact that just the raw footprint has. Like if we were to look at the new building across from Beal's Laundry, would there be any additional, given this, like would they have been able to add even more, or are they still, this lot size, given that it is the parking and everything else, that's as big as it was ever going to be regardless of what this is?
Yeah, we can pick a couple examples and do the math on those and see how they compare to this for a future meeting.
I think you'd find some of those that they probably ask for waivers then to get those buildings in there at, with the current zoning that's available. So, Eric has more history than I do, but I would say that because it's relatively recently permitted, I bet you they asked for waivers considering the density that's there and the parking that's required.
Okay, so this is all good discussion. You had noted in our staff packet that there was a suggested motion. I personally don't feel like at this point in time we're at a place where we can make a motion to kind of move forward with these text amendments because I feel like we've got some questions out there and some updates to be done. So I don't know how everyone else feels about it. I personally like to have as much of a completed product as possible before we move forward with
I'm on the same
motion.
page as you.
Okay, perfect.
We have some good questions and feedback to
Okay.
respond to before we finalize something.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you all for your work, the committee and the staff. This is a lot. So thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, any other questions before we move on to the next workshop item? Okay, seeing none. Next workshop item is an ordinance text change relative to site plan review process and timeline.
So what started this discussion was project that you had reviewed a couple of years ago. It was taking took a few meetings because they were complicated projects. And the issue was raised that our site plan review ordinance technically could allow a developer, if we're taking too long, more than 60 days, to walk away from that review process and assume that their project is approved. And our legal counsel said that's a really bad provision. There are some other communities that have it, but there really should be a little more flexibility for the board to be able to ask for information and for them to take the time they need to put it together and come back before the board. So changing that really drove this discussion. And then as we went through that section in detail, we also looked at how we operate as a development review team now compared to how we did in the past. Looked at adjusting department names to match current structures. But right now we have a process, and I think it's worked pretty well, that integrates all departments into a monthly meeting that happens right after the submittal dates, the week after the submittal dates are due. So the projects get distributed, we have that meeting, and then the departments have a certain amount of time to send us comments back that we can then use to craft the staff reports that you end up with, and allow for some time for the applicant to respond for those. So we've tried to go through that section and make the completeness review, changing from 5 to 10 business days. That allows us to have that meeting and let another department point something out that's missing. The 60-day thing has changed so that you can't unreasonably withhold an approval, but you have the ability to ask for information if it's reasonable that you should expect to have it before you act. And changes the timelines for the public hearing, because establish a timeline of at least 16 days between the director's request to schedule a public hearing and the date. There are instances, depending on how the calendar falls, where we can't run public ads on Mondays, and we need at least one day to put together the ad and get it to the paper before it can be advertised, where the 14 days that we had before wouldn't work. It would be rare, but 16 days make sure that there's no exception to that. The delete the sentence, this is the 60 days. If no action is taken within 60 days of the completed application, the site shall be deemed to have been approved. That's gone. And it extends the expiration of approval for solar generating systems for 2 years after the date of approval, because we really are not finding that any solar projects get constructed in that first 12 months.
Yeah, and I remember we workshopped that piece too.
We talked a little bit about an extension for other projects
Yeah.
too, but at this time, there really was only support for the solar piece, so we left it as that. We clarified that if a project is delayed because of litigation, the approval will not commence until a non-appealable court judgment is issued, because you could have a lower court judgment that then gets appealed, and the project's still on hold until that non-appealable decision is made. So our city attorney recommended that distinction. That's a highlight of the changes. Happy to answer any questions.
I have a quick one. You've mentioned city attorney several times. Just for clarity, are the strike-throughs and the revised verbiage all under the recommendation of legal?
Yes, yep, the work of staff and a couple of elected officials, and then a legal review. And there were some additional changes made with the
When you say
legal.
some elected officials, who else?
We worked with the mayor on some of these changes.
Just the mayor?
I'm trying to think if there was anybody else in those meetings. I think it was just the mayor in that meeting.
I noticed in the public hearings we've got established, is that something, are those two bullets things that don't exist currently are being added? What's the difference between the black versus the red? Or is it the purpose of the bullet is to just...
Talking about the summary or the actual text?
The
of the
establish a time limit of at least, and then it's red underlined 16 days. So does that currently exist? It's on page 2, 60-1304, public hearing findings.
Yeah, let's go to the text of 16-1304.
Okay, yep, so it's meant to be a summary, so you could see materially what the changes are. So, it adds the provision that, it has to be at least 16 days between when the director asks the chair to schedule a meeting and the chair schedules that meeting.
Yeah, before it said, within 30 days of receipt of a completed application, hold a public hearing. But it builds in that timeline for the decision to schedule it to be made after the application is complete, and then we still have 16 days to run the ad. It's a little more specific with that 16-day step. It did not have any specific mention of the period required for notice before.
And then if we stay in that same first paragraph, the planning board will, and then it's in red, not unreasonably delay the, then taking, what did it say originally? I'm trying to put together what was there before.
Good
Yeah,
call.
before, if the board didn't act within 60 days of receiving a completed application, this is the overstrike section in the line below it, or within such other time limit as may be mutual or agreed after public hearing, the project was deemed to be approved.
Wait, so it said, so before it said the planning board will, is the not unreasonably delay new, or was that already there?
It is new. Yeah, it's underlined in red.
So it said, before it said the planning board will take final action on the site plan within is that what it said before?
Yep,
Okay.
of receiving a completed
Gotcha.
application. Unless the developer agrees to an extension to that.
Yeah.
So we didn't want to leave the city stuck with that 60 days if there were logical and reasonable reasons that we needed more information, and either they needed more time or we needed more time to make that.
Okay, so that gives us more flexibility.
It does, yeah. But it still makes sure that it's not unreasonably delayed, so the developer has, we can't just say, we're not gonna make a decision because we really don't like this developer.
Do we have defined somewhere what unreasonable delay actually means?
Thank you.
Otherwise, it's up to interpretation. in my
Yeah,
opinion.
the courts have made a lot of decisions about unreasonably delaying. We could pull some of that case law, but that's the language our attorney recommended. If we have a logical reason, then it's probably not unreasonable. But if we just say we don't want to make a decision because this is a hard one and we don't really like it, you know, that wouldn't hold up.
Yeah, I totally agree with Dave. That is totally subjective. That is one person's perception of reasonable versus another. I think maybe having some kind of
If
data.
there's case law on it, then it's been defined.
That's where I was going. If we have data or something, case law, something that can give us those timeframes, it might be a good idea to have that in here rather than just that statement. That's just my thought.
Yep, yeah, it wouldn't give us timelines, but it would give you a sense of what judges have determined to be reasonable and unreasonable.
All right, thank you.
The other part of that too is that there's statutory requirements for the state, particularly that require additional time. And, you know, we could point to those. For example, there's a requirement for the state to react on Natural Resource Protection Act permits. Same thing with site law, things that are outside the delegated review authority of the city if it's a bigger project. It could be an air emissions license. We gave a few examples in the packet, but there is some timelines that are further out than the 60 days, and that gives us that. We could point to that statutory requirement under that specific license if we needed to.
Can we move to page 5 of 7? So I see section 60-1306 and 60-1307. The findings of the planning board should be in writing, which we do today, then signed by the planning board chair on behalf. So whose idea was to add that?
For subdivisions, we require a signature of the chair and city clerk. For site plan reviews, a lot of communities require a signature
So
from
I'm
the
sorry,
chair.
Eric, my question was who suggested that wording?
That was from Mark Bauer, our city attorney.
The attorney? Okay.
That there be some check that when we get that plan back,
Okay.
that the chair says, yes, this is what we approved. As a
Okay.
signature.
Yeah, so oftentimes when we do our research for subdivisions, older subdivisions, to get the plan of record, it has to have the planning board chair's signature. So that's usually a good check for us, for staff, if it's been actually approved or not. And we're actually working with the final copy that was approved by the
Okay.
planning board.
And I've never signed anything. I can ask Evan if he ever signed anything.
Yeah, we haven't had a lot of subdivisions, and that's really
Okay.
the only ones that we've
Okay.
required subdivision signatures
sign
for.
anything?
But site plans, we have.
One of the two meetings I chaired, I was called in, I had to go sign the plans.
Yeah,
You remember that well, huh?
You gotta come down and sign all the final plans. It's like, what? They're like, well,
You're
you
like,
presided
and I'm
over
all-
that
yeah.
meeting. So, okay.
So funny.
Yeah, I can definitely say that Mr. Sears was in a few times to sign some plans. Some of the smaller subdivisions that we did.
So funny, Riley.
It is odd that we haven't, for your whole tenure as chair, I don't think we've had an actual subdivision.
We've had a lot of other things, though.
A lot of other things, plenty of other things.
It's fine. Okay, any other questions for staff? Okay. All right, seeing none, we can go on to the next agenda item, which is public comment, and I'll open up public comment. Come to the podium, 5 minutes. State your actual residence, like where you actually live, not if you have property in Auburn, but like where your residence, where you actually live, if you come to the podium, please. Thank you.
Stephen Beal. I reside most of the time at a residence in Durham, but have also a single-family residence on Shepley
Okay.
Street in Auburn.
Okay, so
And-
you're in, what's the address in Durham that you live?
Yes, 462 Auburn Pownell Road in Durham.
Okay, Pownell Road. Okay, thank you.
And I wanted to make a couple of quick comments. First, with respect to the detailed discussion about LD 2003, I would urge the board, don't be discouraged by how hard this seems to be, because it is really hard. There's a lot of complex issues here that involve different kinds of considerations, dwelling units, vehicles, parking, green areas, paved areas, and plus we have in Auburn now not only the one overlay zone, the watershed, but we now have the specialty manufacturing overlay zone on the outer hotel road that was just recently enacted. So there's a lot of very complex stuff, and it's going to take some time to work this out. And the comment that was made that other municipalities will have the same kinds of issues, there is going to have to be a body of case law developed before an entire body can be put together and you can reasonably rely on things without having to say, gee, we're the first ones to encounter this problem. That's quite a way in the future. The other comment I wanted to make is with respect to the proposed amendment to the text of the site plan review ordinance to eliminate the default granting of permits after the passage of 60 days. That ordinance has assumed that everyone has been acting in good faith and trying to get the matter resolved within 60 days, and it can't be resolved within 60 days and the default permit issues. This wording of the present ordinance also creates a significant possibility for potential bad faith on the part of a developer. And I'm not speaking about any project or any developer, but frequently when the staff receives an application, it then makes a request for additional information from the developer because the application isn't quite complete. And the developer then could potentially provide a response which provides only half the requested information. So you then make another request and you go back and forth 2 or 3 times and your 60 days is suddenly long gone. And so that's a strong reason for getting rid of that default provision for a permit to issue in the 60-day period. Thank you.
Anyone else like to come to the podium? All right, seeing none, I'll move on to the next agenda item, which is miscellaneous. Upcoming agenda items, and I believe that we also have to talk about a July planning board date too.
Yep, so it's one of those rare months that we have an election 2 months in a row on what would normally be our planning board date. So I'll pull up a calendar actually so we can take a look.
Yeah, I'll just say for the July meeting, I think it was the 11th was the originally scheduled date that we had. If we move back 1 week, then we're the Tuesday before the 4th of July, in the 4th of July week, when the 4th is Thursday. We could do that, but we wanted to make sure the board's aware that's the week of the 4th. There's often a lot of people away that week. Or we'd be looking at going forward to, I think it's the 17th. We'll double check.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like doing it a little bit further, not the week of July 4th.
Good. Get this open. Well, okay, I'm gonna.
Yeah,
pull
so
it.
I think the 17th, what is that?
The Tuesday would be the 18th. Oh, wait, sorry.
No, Tuesday
Wrong
would be-
month.
Tuesday would be the 16th.
Yeah, 16th.
Yep,
Okay,
that's right.
so does that work for folks? Okay,
I can make the 16th.
okay, perfect, great.
We'll
Well-
plan on that.
Okay, great, we'll query the others, but we have a quorum here, so great, awesome. Any other agenda items before we adjourn?
Next month for June, we're planning on having back those septic system amendments. We just still have 2 maps and the Lake Auburn watershed overlay. We left it open for LD 2003, but I think we'll need to do another workshop at least before that. So I am curious, do we want to try to do that workshop at the next meeting, or do you want to, just curious what folks are thinking about that?
Yeah, we can try to prep for that meeting, and then at our agenda setting
That's true.
the week before, if
Okay,
you want, we can
yeah, I
make
like
the
that
final
idea,
decision.
perfect,
Great, okay.
awesome. All right, do I have to do a motion to adjourn?
You should.
Okay. Any other items? Seeing none, I would seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Excellent, perfect. Have a good night, everybody. It was good discussion. It was a lot.